Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to today's deep dive on taxes. This is the second in a series, and very timely. Hopefully, we're gonna spend some time talking about what turned out this week as the governor signed it to be the most historic tax reduction bill in Nebraska history, and talk about what that means and what comes next a little bit. And so, very glad that you could be here with us. If you have questions today that you would like to have us discuss, please put those in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the conversation, we'll have some time for some of your questions. So please include those at any time as we go along. And so Jenna, could you pop up today's presentation? Again, we're going to talk today about the tax relief bill that occurred this week. And then looking forward to what that means for economic growth opportunities in the state going forward. So Jen, if you could take me to the first slide. I think it's important to really start this conversation with where we were January 1 of this year as we came into this year. These are the state business tax climate rankings that came from the Tax Foundation at the beginning of the year before any legislation in any of these states. And as you can see, these are the states that surround us: Wyoming, South Dakota, Missouri, Colorado, Kansas, and Iowa, along with Nebraska, and how we ranked out of the 50 states in various types of taxes that affect businesses. And you can see we didn't do well. Overall, our score was 35th out of 50 states. Every other state around us was in the top 25 other than Iowa. Iowa was actually more poorly rated than Nebraska. It was 38th overall. You note that on the bottom of the page, Iowa on March 1st of this year adopted a new tax laws which target ultimately to get to a 3.9% flat tax rate for individual taxes and a 5.5% rate for corporate taxes. That was a very substantial piece of tax legislation for Iowa, and after Iowa adopted that, clearly they were not 38th anymore in overall tax score, and would have moved well into the top 25, leaving Nebraska as we entered April, really from an overall tax standpoint is the only state in the region that was not in the top 25 of tax business climate. You also start to see the detail between corporate, individual, sales, and property taxes in this chart, and it's helpful to understand and understand how and why the tax bill that we had in Nebraska was put together. If you look at corporate, again, Nebraska and Iowa were the worst at 32 and 38. We have had prior to this bill very high corporate tax rates, 7.5%, even with the reduction that started last year. Iowa now is going to be at 5.5. From an individual tax standpoint, again, bottom 25, very high rates at 6.84, and Iowa as well, but everybody else in the top 25, with Wyoming and South Dakota in income taxes, as we know, ranking 1 because they have none. The sales tax numbers are interesting as well, in that from a sales tax standpoint, Nebraska is very competitive, ranking 14th out of the 50 states, and that was true in Iowa. And then on property tax, you'll see Iowa and Nebraska were pretty similar, again at the bottom, 39 and 40, very high property taxes, whereas Missouri and South Dakota were much lower, but the rest were all pretty high property tax states. And so when you looked at Nebraska, it was a combination of very high income taxes and very high property taxes that was driving this uncompetitive situation. It was really important for the state legislature to pass some sort of reforms this year to keep Nebraska in the game and keep us competitive as we try to attract people and we try to attract jobs and investments by businesses within our state. It would have been very difficult for our economic developers to really pursue a lot of projects with uncompetitive taxes against virtually every one of the states that surround us. So let's talk a little bit about the tax legislation that did pass and the governor did sign yesterday. So Jen, if you could move me to the next page. From an income tax standpoint, Biggest tax cut in Nebraska history. The governor was quoted yesterday as he signed it saying, this tax cut is 12 times as big as any other tax cut in Nebraska history in terms of the amount of relief provided. And I believe it. On the individual side, it starts in 2023, reduces from 6.84 to 6.64. And then over a period of 5 years, it ultimately gets our individual rate down to 5.84%. And you can see that the tax relief number is 434 million. So at one level, you say, well, we have over 1 million workers in this state, 700,000 households. So maybe it's $400 a worker, and maybe it's, $500 a household. Is that much, Sloan? Yes, $434 million of tax relief moved into our economy, and the multiplier that relates to that. That's a very substantial amount of tax relief going into the state, and again, historically the largest ever. Similarly, on the business side, we had a 7.5% rate going into this year. In 2023, that'll come down to 7.25, and that moves even faster. Down to 5.84% by 2027, $84 million in tax relief, a very significant corporate tax rate relief, really important in terms of achieving and attracting corporate investments in Nebraska and having corporations expand their presence in Nebraska and derive more of their income from Nebraska and frankly, put more of their jobs in Nebraska. So these two things together are going to be very, very significant for Nebraska. At 5.84%, it keeps us in the game. And you say, well, Sloan, how can that be true if I was going to 3.9% flat? Remember, flat tax generally is on adjusted gross income without itemized deductions. And so it's a little bit apples to oranges, but 5.84 keeps us in striking distance and all the other advantages that Nebraska has, keeps us within striking distance of the other states. Probably more work to do for Nebraska as we go forward, because we have a lot of states that are really driving a rate down as close to zero as they can get. I think a lot of states are going to ultimately land, depending on the economy, somewhere under 4%. So perhaps some more work for us to do, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But I don't want to diminish in any way how historic this tax cut, individual income tax and corporate tax relief package was that was signed by the governor, and really want to thank the governor and Senator Linehan and the speaker, Chair Linehan of the Revenue Committee, for some incredible leadership and all the members of our legislature that voted to move this forward. One other thing on this slide before I go, what's sometimes lost but is also important about this slide, we'll finally get the individual tax rate and the business corporate rate at the same level, 5.84%. We've been for many years now in a situation where corporate rates actually exceeded individual rates. And so you could have two identical businesses, each with the identical income. But if you were organized as a corporation, you were paying more tax than if you were a flow through. Not sensical tax policy, in my mind, sort of anti-corporate tax policy. And so now putting parity between those rates is a very, very big deal. So Jenna, take me to the next slide, if you would. In terms of property tax, remember property tax, we were in the top 10 heaviest property tax states. We were rated 40th out of 50. And so we have, this is no surprise to anybody, very high property tax. What the bill did this week was that it created more income tax credits for property taxes paid. I'm going to start with the bottom. This is an extension of a bill that was passed last year, providing income tax credits for school property taxes, but it had a phase out, and without it, a substantial amount of that relief was going to diminish over time. This bill preserved that relief and extended it so that beginning tax year 2022, there'll be an additional $548 million in tax relief and $560 million in 2023. Beyond that, that number is allowed to grow with a 5% cap as we go in years beyond that. Those are substantial amounts of income or property tax relief, all focused on the school property taxes that people pay. And so when they get their statements this year, they should see very significant numbers in terms of credits for property taxes paid that can be taken as income tax credits, not property tax credits. The bill also extended that to income tax credits for property taxes paid related to community colleges. And again, that increases over time, starting in 2022 at 50 million total in tax relief and growing to 195, and then at beyond 27 and beyond, again, subject to that same 5% allowable growth rate. These two things combined provide essentially about the same amount of property tax relief as there was income tax relief. This was a pretty balanced bill. This bill was obviously supported by property tax homeowners and farmers and ranchers throughout the state, and on the income tax side, obviously by our businesses. This really is going to do make some substantial changes to our tax rating, our business tax rating as a state. And my guess is, I just see the question come in. I'm not sure specifically until we get those ratings back out. I'm fairly confident we're going to be well into the top 25 now in terms of income taxes, where we want to be, and ultimately someday we want to be in the top 10 lowest income tax states if it were up to me. But I think we're going to be very competitive with Iowa. I think we're going to be very competitive with our neighboring states going forward. So let's go to the next slide. There were some other pieces to this bill that we should talk about. One is Social Security income tax relief. For those of you who are my generation, these things start to mean something to us as we go forward. We were one of the states historically that taxed Social Security income. Many states did not. Last year, a bill was put in to eliminate that tax over 10 years. What this bill did was take last year's bill and just accelerate it. And so that instead of 10 years, by 2025 now, we'll have 100% exclusion of Social Security income tax or income from taxes in the state of Nebraska. That's another 70 million in relief. This is a big deal because we have a very substantial amount of our older population, which now includes me, that is really burdened by taxes on Social Security income, and it's a deterrent to other forms of income among this group, and it's big numbers. This is the baby boomer generation at this point, so this will be a very big deal, and was part of this package as well. So Jenna, could you move me to the next slide? So that was the bill in essence, and it really put us in a very good position as a state to continue to be competitive. But there's going to be next steps, and I thought I'd highlight a few of the things that at least I would expect we would begin to see in the next session and going forward. Clearly, there's a piece of legislation, a legislative proposal out there that was introduced this year in the legislature that there's been a lot of discussion about, which is the Blueprint Modernization Bill. And the Blueprint Nebraska project had as one of its initiatives creating a more efficient and modernized tax structure. Our tax structure still is very outdated and decades old. What Blueprint would propose, and we've talked about this in prior deep dives of the state chambers, Blueprint basically proposes broadening the tax base and going to a flat tax, not totally unlike where Iowa is, and trying to get to something close to a 3.9% tax rate. The Blueprint modernization, that broadening of the tax base, is primarily in sales taxes. Remember that we are one of the lowest sales tax states, and primarily in the area, but not exclusively, primarily in the area of services. Generally, but not exclusively again, but generally in Nebraska, we don't tax most services. And so the Blueprint Modernization Bill would seek to tax a broader categories, particularly of services, under our existing sales tax mechanism, and then apply the revenues attached to that to provide further income tax relief, and then also move to a flat tax system where the taxes would be based on adjusted gross income, and we could get down to something close, according to that modeling on Blueprint, to something close to a 3.9% rate. That would be potentially transformational. My sense is that there's always controversy whenever there's a full-scale modernization proposal like this, but my sense is that this will be discussed, and the Blueprint modernization plan will likely be sort of the first part of the discussion for the Revenue Committee next year, and whether to further modernize the tax code. And it's certainly something that will be engaged in those discussions. There's a second consumption tax proposal out there that we've talked about briefly in the last session, was the EPIC tax proposal. The EPIC tax proposal is to eliminate all of the taxes in Nebraska and simply go to one big consumption tax. We've opposed that this year in the legislature because the numbers don't quite add up for us, and it looks to us like we would end up with something at least between a 13 to 20% tax rate, and that it would drive business and transactions out of the state, which would not be good for our businesses nor good for our economy. That said, the EPIC tax proposal is very general at this point. There are lots of details missing. I suspect that over the summer, the proponents of the consumption tax will provide more details and amend that proposal. And I would suspect we will see another EPIC tax, consumption tax proposal that comes to the Revenue Committee as well next year. So I think you'll see a Revenue Committee that will be looking at sales taxes and consumption taxes. What they do with that is it will be open, but as you think about base broadening and further tax relief going forward, it's clear that very significant amounts of tax relief, like in other states, would involve some base broadening. So I expect those two proposals to be front and center. Thirdly, there was a lot of discussion this year during this tax bill about the brackets. And I don't think most people in the state really understand where the brackets are on our individual income taxes. Particularly, we move people through brackets really quickly in Nebraska, and that was not changed with this bill. I suspect that we will have some senators asking to take a look at further bracket relief next year, particularly of lower middle income taxpayers. And we'll see how those discussions goes, but I think that will also be on tap, which is the distribution of brackets and where they occur. Two other issues that I think are going to become really important as we go forward with state tax policy are going to be research and development credits. Unfortunately, the research and development credit this year was not extended by the legislature. I think it was simply a time issue. There will be a discussion inevitably next year around research and development credits, because as I'll talk about more in a minute, in addressing our workforce issues and challenges, and in addressing where the state's economy needs to go in our core sectors, it's clear, as noted in the blueprint report, that investments in innovation technology are going to be key. And certainly core research and development are going to be key to be competitive and to address some of these issues. We're going to need some pretty robust research and development incentives within the state. And so I suspect that will be a very large issue to be discussed next year in the Revenue Committee, and as a tax policy matter generally, and a growth policy for the state. The last area where I expect some conversation next year is this remote workforce taxation issue. And this one is new. Everything else is been around for a while, but this one is relatively new following the pandemic, which is so much of our country's workforce is now working remotely. States are taking a hard look at a couple issues. One is just the administration of remote workforce. Is that remote worker taxed in the state they're working in, or are they taxed in the state where they're working for? And states are having a little bit difficult time with this, particularly if the remote work is, you see a lot of companies going to 3 days a week in the office and 2 days a week at home, or 3 days at home and 2 days in the office. How does that work when, for instance, the company is located in Omaha and the person lives in Council Bluffs, or the company is located in Sioux City, Iowa, but they're living in South Sioux? Where does that W-2 get taxed? Is it divided based upon the physical location they're working, or is are they taxed in the where the office is located, or does it matter which one they're located in more, the 3 days or the 2 days? These are all issues that states across the country are starting to deal with. And what's best for workers and what's best for companies is to come to some uniform rule around this and make sure that there's a clear understanding. It also affects withholding. And so it's going to become more difficult as we go on. But the second big issue is every state wants to attract these remote workers. In a world where we're trying to grow our population and grow our workforce, attracting remote workers is a real opportunity for Nebraska. We now live in a world where anybody can live wherever they want to and essentially work for any company in the world they want to, from anywhere. And this is a tremendous opportunity for Nebraska to attract people and workforce. And so I sense we're going to want to make Nebraska as attractive as possible. So let's move to the final slide, or the final two slides. I think as we start talking about tax policy, there's a lot of old issues that we'll be talking about, including broadening the tax base and flattening rates, which is generally good tax policy. But there's some new disruptive threats that really are, as we talk about the state's growth, going to affect not only how we talk about tax policy, but how we integrate tax policy with other things. This is a graph showing since 1940 employment in Nebraska. And I raise this, and it only goes through 2021. So it's showing the beginning portions of the pandemic. And I raise this because what you see is employment reaching a little bit over a million people in Nebraska in 2019 at its peak. And then you see what the pandemic did in 2020. It started to recover in 2021. In 2022, we've now reached essentially right where we were in 2019. So if I were to extend this graph into 2022, you would see that line go up to essentially we're back to where we were in 2019. That's good news, but we lost 2 years of employment growth in this state, and that gap is pretty substantial. Workforce is now, without question, the number one issue in the state right now, and we have anywhere from 50 to 80,000 jobs. We have 50,000 listed. And my guess is we have 80,000 jobs in this state on any given day that cannot be filled because we don't have the population and workforce. The solutions to that are going to have to be part of what we consider an economic growth. So while taxes are going to drive a lot of it, and what further we do in terms of tax modernization is going to drive a lot of how we view our economic growth potential, there's also this labor and workforce issue along with technology and innovation that goes with it. We won't clearly be able to recruit enough people to solve all of that issue. And so core investments into innovation and technology within our core industries, manufacturing, agriculture, financial services, transportation, logistics, are going to be key to keeping our productivity levels at a level that our growth continues, and that we will have the revenues to continue to reduce taxes and to hopefully modernize our taxes over time. So let me finish with just give you a sense of the issues around this workforce problem and how that's going to fit into our tax policies going forward. So final slide. And I'm just going to hit these briefly and then open it up to questions. As we look at workforce and technology, essentially for our legislature and our next governor, we're going to have to do a whole bunch of things well all at the same time. And even our federal delegation. In addition to continuing to modernize our tax code and continue to become more competitive as other states do that, we're going to have to become better at immigration and refugees. Clearly, that's a very significant place where we can add people and workforce to our state. And we're going to have to develop communities that are very responsive and capable to handling immigration and refugees. We're going to have to recruit 18 to 34-year-olds, and we're going to have to spend some money as a state to really create a recruitment process. We're going to have to connect students who are in this state, literally tens and tens of thousands of students, and actually well over 100,000 students in this state in various colleges and universities. We need to connect them to this state and keep them. A lot of people in poverty or near poverty that we need to put in higher paying jobs. But maybe the biggest impediment that we have, and I think this we need to think about in terms of our tax code as well, is even if we were to receive, let's say, 10,000 refugees today, we'd have no place to house them. And we clearly need, Blueprint said 40,000 housing units before the pandemic. My guess is that number's larger now. Well, let's say 50 or 60,000 affordable housing units are key just right now to us being able to solve this workforce issue. Childcare capacity is part of that, community infrastructure and development. And that's really changing our downtowns to be attractive to these 18 to 34-year-olds. There's some really incredible projects going on in a number of communities around the state. We just need to continue to support and accelerate that. Recreation, the Big Lake, and certainly Lewis and Clark and McConaughey, the things that the legislature worked on this year will be key to that. I've talked about state branding and recruiting. I'm going to finish with technology and next generation businesses. I've talked a little bit about it's really important that we attract and retain not only the companies, but the jobs associated with technology in our core industries. Agriculture, manufacturing is an example. Agriculture is going to change overnight in the next 5 years to something much closer to a precision ag model. And technology, farmers and ranchers are going to become, if they're not already, technologists as much as anything else. We need those technology resources and technology companies here, because that's going to be a significant part of the profitability of ag going forward. And then finally, we have a very substantial number of our businesses, a very substantial amount of our wealth in this state, which is are in the hands of people of my generation, and we need this next generation of business leaders and business owners in this state, so as not to be owned by entities outside the state necessarily. And this process requires not only attracting these 18 to 34-year-olds, but getting them in ownership and community and business leadership positions. All of these things are going to have to happen. And as we think about the tax code, generally, I'm a believer in tax codes not having lots of incentives, certainly at the federal level. Broadening the base, lowering the rates has always been successful in the past. But in this case, where we're competing against the 50 other states for workforce, I think we may have to think about making exceptions. And how can we use the tax code around housing, around childcare, around developing technology and research? Should we be in that business at least for the next 10 years? And I think my answer would be yes. So as we work with the Revenue Committee next year, I think you'll see the State Chamber also trying to address some of these issues within any tax policy that we're trying to drive. So with that, Holly, I'll open it up to any questions.
Great. We did have one question, Brian, here before we leave for the day. It's about the sales tax exemptions and the removal of those exemptions suggested by the blueprint plan as it exists today. Are those set in stone? Do you expect more debate or kind of activity around that, particularly related to the types of services that Nebraskans need versus, things that are maybe more luxury?
I think it's a great question. I think, I think the Blueprint Nebraska folks did some really hard work, and they spent a lot of time, and they've put in the detail, and they have the economic models around it. I think I can speak for them in saying what they did in that process was to create their best economic model of what was possible in terms of broadening the base. I don't think anybody expected the blueprint proposal to be set in stone. But what they wanted to do was put the broadest possible proposal in front of the Revenue Committee. And then there will inevitably be the process that would go on with any tax bill, which is really taking a look at each individual exemption, identifying the impact, and making sure that we weren't precluding necessary services or moving services across state boundaries. But the blueprint proposal at least tees up the issue in its broadest sense. And then I think there'll be months and months of analysis associated with that before we get a tax modernization bill. And I hope we do. And certainly the Chamber's interested in both sides of that, one, achieving the tax modernization, but clearly making sure that the sales tax exemptions that are out there are consistent with what we see in other states and won't drive business to other states. But it's appropriate and it's timely. I think about every 20 years, every state should take a hard look at modernizing its entire system. And so I'm looking forward to next year.
But they shouldn't modernize before us, right? Sorry, had to get it in.
I get it.
That's all our questions. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Any last words, Bryan?
No, I think I just, again, I don't think people appreciate how historic this week's tax bill really was. And again, a big thanks to the governor and Chair Linehan and the speaker and the members of the Revenue Committee and the legislature. And I don't think we really realize how big the challenge is in front of us to stay competitive. Other states are moving really fast, not only on their tax codes, but integrating their tax codes with these issues of like housing and that will be so important to this workforce issue. But I couldn't be more excited because I think we've certainly have the business community focused on this and the legislature's focused on these issues. We just need to continue to move. So looking forward to next year.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.